The firing squad shot him 5 times, but what investigators found in the mass grave made no sense. It wasn't only bullets that had ended that man's war. It was something far less visible: petroleum. The image shocks because it promises a crime scene, a human story of execution and loss. Stay with that shock for a moment. Then consider this. When soldiers stripped a field in eastern Belgium in December 1944, what they expected to find were answers, supplies, trophies, evidence. What they actually uncovered was a landscape of abundance and denial that would rewrite what victory looked like that winter. The documents that survive from those days tell a stranger story than the one your mind's eye first conjures. Before we move from the graveyard to the gas cans, a word of transparency. The opening vignette you heard is a dramatized composite meant to capture the human cost and moral confusion of the period. Names and some details in that scene are representative. Later in this episode, we'll pivot to the archival record, unit diaries, captured manifests, engineering reports, and show what officials actually wrote day by day. It is dawn, clear and brittle with cold. Men step out of the trees into the washed-out light over a little village named Hansfeld. Shovels scrape frozen earth. There is the sharp metallic smell of gasoline in the air, a smell that promises warmth to a soldier more than bread does in winter. Pails and jerry cans glint like small fortunes. They are stacked on pallets in neat rows, knee-high then waist-high, an improbable, almost childish fortress of tin. A corporal runs a hand along the seam of a can, as if to check whether the world is still solid. Someone counts in a whisper, tens, hundreds, thousands. In the records that followed, the pile at Hansfeld is described as roughly 50,000 gallons of fuel, enough to keep a regiment moving for some days, enough to revive an offensive, enough to make the men who found it believe, briefly, that fate had smiled on them. That moment, the rush, the scooping, the sudden, almost obscene well-being of finding what has been denied, is central to the story, but it is not the whole story. In the papers captured, in the headlines of the Allied newspapers carried forward by their own troops, and the manifests clipped together and stored in shipping chests and staff cars, Hansfeld reads like a footnote. It is a treasure chest in a world where the opposing side controls 2 oceans of logistics, pipelines under the channel, daily convoys on ending, depots choked with reserves. To the men who stumbled on those jerry cans, the sight looked like salvation. To staff officers 2 echelons removed, it was an ordinary drop in a very large ocean. If this episode matters to you and you want the primary sources, maps, and manifest scans we use here, hit subscribe and check the pinned sources in the description.
There you'll find the unit diaries and selected photographs that anchor every major claim we make. The arithmetic of supply is relentless and, in modern war, often decisive. Combat units consume mass. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft are hungry machines that measure distance in gallons. The Germans had plainly understood that when they launched their Ardennes offensive, an attempt to split the Allied front and seize Antwerp. Success would depend on capturing Allied depots and getting hold of petroleum. The plan assumed that operational momentum could be sustained by seizing supply, and that fuel seized at the front would feed the spearhead at the rate engines demanded. What they did not fully anticipate was the scale and redundancy of Allied logistics. By late 1944, the Allied supply chain had stretched and matured into a system that could move fuel from North American refineries and British depots deep into France and Belgium. There were several mechanisms, and they reinforced one another. First came pipelines, crude, stubborn lines laid under and across beaches, roads, and shell-wrecked fields that carried fuel in volumes far beyond what convoys alone could support. Engineers built these under pressure and often under fire. The pipelines were slow to put in place, but once operational, they delivered a steadiness that trucks could not match. They were, in effect, blood vessels for the army on the move. Then there were the truck convoys. The Red Ball Express is the name most associated with that effort. Thousands of trucks, driven day and night, routed on cleared lanes. Their mission, single-minded: pump fuel forward and keep the front supplied. Those truck lines were vulnerable to weather and ambush. They were also astonishing in their output, moving loads that would have taken an entire navy in earlier wars. Reports from the period record convoys running in ways, drivers sleeping in cab crevices, mechanics cannibalizing parts to keep engines running. Convoys meant visibility. Convoys consumed men, tires, and convoy discipline, but they also made supply a visible brute force fact that could not be entirely interdicted by a single offensive. From the captured documents and the engineers' papers that made it back to Allied headquarters emerge a picture of throughput. Fuel arriving at ports, pumped ashore, loaded into casks, pushed through pipelines, hauled by truck to field depots, and then metered out by quartermaster detachments to units that came forward. The daily totals in those reports read like an industrial ledger more than a soldier's diary. For the Wehrmacht, watching an Allied fuel pipeline run was like watching an enemy conveyor feed a future they could not break. This imbalance is easier to grasp when you imagine the machines on the ground. Heavy German tanks, the Panzers with long-barreled guns and heavy armor, demanded enormous quantities of fuel, especially when engines strained over icy roads and into mud.
The heavier the tank, the less forgiving the consumption. Even in cruising, a modern heavy tank chews through fuel rapidly. In combat, recovery scenarios, or when engine idling and heating are required for winter operations, consumption spiked. By contrast, the American logistical system relied extensively on manufacturer standardization, mass-produced spare parts, and a supply doctrine that expected high attrition and planned for it with redundancy. That meant available replacement fuel, spare engines, and whole trucks waiting in peripheral depots, not always on the battlefield, but behind it, ready to be shuttled forward. The captured German testimonies reveal frustration that cuts across ranks. A regimental commander, in contemporaneous notes referred to by a nickname whose transcription is unclear, described the moment his unit ran empty as surreal. "Our tanks lay in line like beasts sucking at an empty trough," the report paraphrases. A German NCO interviewed later in captivity recalled crews stripping vehicles of radios and instruments in hope of exchange for fuel. He described men dismantling piping, even valves, in an attempt to siphon the last drops. Those recollections show not only logistic collapse, but a psychological one. Fighting is possible without reserves, but armies lose the will to sustain a gamble when the fuel gauge reads zero more often than it reads full. The second, counterintuitive part of this story is the choice made by Allied commanders and engineers when confronted with the risk of losing fuel to enemy capture. They destroyed it. Scorched earth is a familiar concept, but here the calculus was different. Allied supply doctrine was not to hoard resources in forward positions that could be easily overrun. Instead, in several locations where the risk of capture was real and the local fuel was expendable in the strategic sense, engineers burned and detonated storage to deny any tactical advantage to German forces. The image of Americans orchestrating massive, controlled explosions or setting entire depots alight has the immediate sting of waste. Yet that destruction was done amid a calculus of abundance. Destroy here to prevent a short-term tactical boon to the enemy, because withholding the fuel was a smaller cost than allowing the enemy to translate it into a longer operational reach. To the German soldier who stumbled on a pile of jerrycans at Hansfield, the sight of nearby burn pits or blackened earth must have seemed proof of an American madness. To the logistics officer with a map and manifest, burning a depot might be a perfectly rational choice, inconvenient and heartbreaking, but strategically thin against the massive supplies farther to the rear. One wartime courier wrote in a staff diary about the irony, "They burn what they can't move. We die for what we can't have."
Files taken from captured German positions include shipping manifests that record what was supposed to arrive, what actually arrived, and what was either expended or destroyed. These manifests are the bones of the story. They show day by day tens of thousands of gallons moved along corridors, routed through newly laid pipes, or funneled into truck convoys. They also show line items marked "denied to enemy" or coded references to demolition operations. When historians later pieced together these records with photographs of blackened pits and film of convoys rolling through Belgian towns, a broader narrative took shape. The Allied system was not merely resupplying, it was saturating the theater to the point where denial burned reservoirs that for the enemy would have been a godsend. Numbers are what give this story its moral weight. A single captured depot at Hansfield might have given a battalion life for a day. A network of pipelines and truck routes made possible a theater where millions of gallons could be shifted in weeks. The psychological effect on German officers, who had been led to expect that capturing fuel would be proof of strategic superiority, was devastating. Where they had assumed scarcity, they encountered, in pockets, abundance. Where they expected to outmaneuver supply, they met a logistics machine. Statements and interrogations recorded at the time underline the point. Commanding officers reported not simply a lack, but confusion.
How could such a thing be allowed to happen? How could fuel be burned in front of them? The answer lies less in cruelty than in arithmetic. When you have the luxury to burn to deny, and you have reserves elsewhere, sacrifice in the small becomes an instrument of survival in the large. That arithmetic plays out in the field in brutal, visible ways. Photos taken by forward reconnaissance show German tanks abandoned by the roadside with tracks intact and turrets turned toward an enemy who was not firing on them. On one stretcher in a photograph, 2 crewmen sit with their helmets in their laps. Empty canteens are scattered nearby. The tanks are not shredded by rounds, they are immobilized by absence. Their guns peer out of cold metal mouths without the sustenance to fire. An anonymous quartermaster's note from the period reads flatly, "Not destroyed by fire, destroyed by absence." As the narrative widens from the small discovery at Hansfield to theater-wide logistics, the contrast becomes sharper. Allied engineers were expanding supply networks, laying pipe and opening routes at a scale that made German attempts at capture feel like plucking raisins from a loaf. The operational tempo depended on keeping that supply flowing. Without it, the spearhead stopped. The Germans had placed a bet that their offensive could reach the nodes of supply before Allied redundancy closed the gap.
In many places, they were nearly successful tactically, but strategically thwarted by the sheer mass of Allied logistics. Accounts from Allied field engineers are instructive and, at times, coldly clinical. An engineer's report describes controlled burns and detonations in detached language. Fuel tanks emptied and burned to prevent capture where retrieval was impracticable. The phrase, "where retrieval was impracticable," hides the larger picture, the calculus that allowed commanders to accept destruction as deterrence because alternative reserves existed not far back. It is an ethical line and also a logistical one. To the men who faced death that winter, the line between necessity and waste was experienced in the moment as moral fog. We can break the mechanics down further with a simple example, not to be exact about gallons per mile, those figures vary by vehicle, terrain, and load, but to sketch scale. Imagine a company of heavy tanks moving at speed in winter conditions. Their combined consumption, when multiplied over a single day's movement and combat operations, quickly equals the contents of an entire soft-skinned transport convoy. Add the fuel needs of reconnaissance cars, supply trucks, ambulances, and the aircraft overhead. A small push forward becomes a vast appetite. Multiply that by the number of pushes needed to sustain an offensive, and you begin to understand why control of depots and pipeline nodes was tantamount to command of movement itself. This is also why Allied logistics had been a deliberate strategic priority long before December 1944. The pipeline efforts, the insistence on keeping ports open, the convoy prioritization systems, all of these were investments in time and industry. They were, in many ways, the invisible front on which the war was being won. General Staff memoranda from the period emphasize that fighting without supplies is an exercise in illusion. Victory depends not only on taking ground, but on feeding the ground you take with men, parts, and fuel. Even these broad explanations, however, do not fully account for the moral dissonance of burning. Photographs and later testimony show workers, some under orders and some reluctant, setting cans and tanks alight. The flames are high, pillars of black smoke licking the low winter sky, reflecting off snow and leaves. For the men ordered to do it, the act felt like ceremonial waste. For staff planners, it was a pragmatic denial. For the enemy watching the smoke and the ash, it read as either madness or malice. The truth sits in between, a deliberate, cold decision made under pressure, with consequences that were both practical and symbolic. There is, at the same time, an intimate tragedy in these calculations. Those who fought in the Ardennes were not abstract numbers. They were individuals whose lives could hinge on a single liter of fuel.
A burned depot meant that a recon patrol could not reach its objective. It meant that a wounded man might not be evacuated in time because no trucks could be spared to carry him. Thinking in terms of industrial supremacy risks forgetting these faces. That is the moral tension at the core of this story. Supply is both the sinew of strategy and the source of private suffering. And so we come back to the moment that introduced this episode, the grave, the execution's aftermath, and the piles of jerry cans at Hansfeld.
For the Germans who found that cache, perspective shifted in a day from triumph to bewilderment to defeat. For the Allies who later documented what happened, Hansfeld was one small proof of a much larger truth. Yet the scene at Hansfeld also forced a hard question on the record keepers. How do you reconcile images of waste with a doctrine of preservation and necessity? It is here that the documents become most candid. Staff notes, quartermaster comments, and engineer reports use a language of pragmatism and occasional apology, acknowledging that destruction incurred costs, but arguing that those costs were preferable to the operational risk of leaving fuel to enemy hands. Behind these bureaucratic lines, human stories accumulate. There are hospital notes about injured drivers who never returned, diary entries from soldiers who watched their officers place black matches to tanks full of petrol, and later interrogations in which captured commanders try to explain their decisions under oath. In the German records, frustration becomes plaintive. Officers accuse the high command of miscalculation. Logistics clerks record shortages. A private writes simply, "We fought for roads we could not fill." The story could proceed in two directions. One is narrow and sensational, a single shooting and a single mass grave examined for clues. The other direction is wider and in some ways stranger, a theater so drenched in fuel that destroy to deny orders were part of the routine, a technological and industrial momentum that reduced the battlefield to arithmetic. Both directions lead to human consequence, but the larger lens shows why tactics failed even when soldiers fought well. Logistics had become the decisive instrument. What follows next in the records are scenes both cinematic and devastating. Field engineers orchestrated burns in the gray light of winter. Columns of smoke marked places where millions of gallons had been rendered useless at a stroke. Forward units found disabled tanks with turrets intact and engines cold. Sometimes crews had been evacuated. Sometimes men had simply walked away, their movement stopped by the absence that a leader would have prevented. Staff reports begin to cluster around certain names of places, depots and small towns whose identities, in the paperwork, are sometimes garbled or inconsistently spelled, and around a single stark figure, that of denied fuel measured in the millions of gallons.
This accumulation of detail is where the documentary record becomes both precise and maddeningly incomplete. It tells us that fuel was burned, that depots were destroyed, and that Germans expected to capture supplies that were no longer available to them. What it does not tell us in every instance is the full moral calculus behind each decision, the conversations intense at night, the weighing of one life against the movement of a division, the private horror of an engineer ordered to light the match. For that, we must rely on diaries and interviews and the fragments of memory filed amid the manifest ledgers. And so the narrative turns now toward one of those depots, a location referred to in multiple reports as Stavelo, where engineers set a controlled blaze that would throw a pillar of smoke into the winter sky and leave a mark on the calculations of both sides. The photographs that survive show black columns, men silhouetted on ridges, and rings of empty cans like tide marks on a beach. For an enemy watching, the sight could be interpreted only as an act of lunacy. For an Allied logistician holding a map and a manifest, it was, brutal as it was, a rehearsal of strategic denial. We pause here at that image, smoke, stacked cans, and the wreck of a plan that would, for a time, make movement impossible. The moment bristles with questions that the documents will answer in part and complicate in others. How many gallons were consumed in that sacrificial burn? Which units felt the absence most acutely? And what did the German commanders conclude when they saw not only one pile of jerrycans at Hansfeld, but depots deliberately rendered impotent by the enemy? Those questions lead into a set of reports and testimonies that change how the Ardennes offensive is understood, not as a failure of courage or a single tactical misstep, but as a strategic collision between movement and machines of supply. The next section of the record moves from scenes of destruction to calculations of consumption, the diaries of quartermasters, the orders of supply battalions, the skeletal maps drawn by engineers who counted leaders and routes like cartographers count contour lines. It is there, in those dry, numerical accounts, that a new kind of front line reveals itself, one not measured in kilometers, but in gallons per day.
When we pick that thread back up, we will follow the manifests and the maps, the convoy routes and the pipeline diagrams, and the after-action notes that record abandoned armor as both testament and casualty. We will examine the decisions made by commanders who preferred denial to capture, and we will listen to the men who had to light the fires. For now, keep the image of the burning depot in your mind. It is a moral and operational crossroads that will make sense only when placed beside the ledger books and the trucks that kept rolling, night after night, toward Antwerp and beyond.
The ledger books lead us next to Stavalo, a name that recurs in engineer reports, staff notes, and a handful of photographs. A depot where, in the gray of winter, men in overcoats and helmets set the match to millions of gallons of fuel. The exact totals recorded across different files vary, and precise tallies remain the subject of archival verification for some entries. The consistent picture is clear nevertheless. Where German units had counted on capture, they found instead a pillar of black smoke and an arithmetic that did not add up to advantage. What happened at Stavalo, as the paperwork describes, was not a spontaneous inferno, but an orchestrated denial. Engineers arrived with orders and with methods refined over months of planning. Tanks and drums were siphoned into improvised pits or fed into burners. Where groups of jerry cans clustered, they were stacked and soaked with diesel, then ignited under controlled conditions. The images that survive show men working against freezing fingers, their breath lost in the same columns of smoke that took the fuel with them. An engineer's notation, laconic and administrative, reads, "Storage destroyed to prevent capture. Method, combustion, reason, impracticable retrieval." Those three words, storage destroyed, are a shorthand for a judgment that weighed the immediate cost of burning against a strategic cost far greater, the chance that the enemy would translate a forward supply into sustained movement. To appreciate why commanders chose that calculus, we return from the pit to the map. The Allied system of supply by late 1944 was layered and redundant. Alongside port receptions and railheads, there were pipelines, the undersea and overland arteries that collectively carried the flow of petrol from rear depots forward, and there were truck armies on assigned roads. The pipeline projects, sometimes grouped under the label Pluto in popular memory, represented a new way to think about fuel, not as discrete drums to be ferried by hand, but as a continuous flow that could be pumped day after day. A break in a single link mattered, but the existence of multiple routes and large reserves meant that loss in one node did not stop the flow elsewhere. Truck convoys were equally important. The Red Ball Express has become shorthand for an image of endless trucks, headlights in rain, drivers alternating rest in cabs, wheels devouring the night. The truth is more complicated and no less impressive. A prioritized system of roads, scheduled runs, and ad hoc maintenance that turned petrol into motion. Scale here matters more than precise figures, in the sense that the Germans were confronting a supply culture rather than a supply moment. Where a captured depot might supply a battalion for a day or two, the Allied apparatus was organized to sustain armies across weeks by moving and replenishing continuously. German plannings had counted on capturing nodes to bridge their fuel shortfalls.
Their industry could not match Allied throughput, and bombing had already taken a toll on synthetic refineries and supply lines. This is important. German petroleum capability relied heavily on synthetic production, plants converting coal into liquid fuels, and the strategic bombing campaign attacked that infrastructure with increasing effectiveness. The result was that German operational planning had to assume scarcity. Each liter was precious, and the calculus of risk and reward focused on seizing supplies whenever possible. In the face of Allied redundancy, that calculus failed. The field evidence is brutal. Reconnaissance photographs show panthers and tigers abandoned on the road shoulder with hatches closed, still bearing the fresh scratches of recent service. Tracks are clean of battle scars. The machine is intact but motionless. Close-up images reveal small practical solutions attempted in desperation. Jerry cans lashed to fenders, improvised tow hooks welded from scavenged metal, camouflage netting left draped over idle guns. In many cases, crews had evacuated in haste once the engine died, and recovery was judged impossible. In other cases, soldiers removed radios, optics, and anything portable so that the enemy would not inherit working systems, a decision that had the small, bitter dignity of denying a prize the enemy would otherwise welcome. Captured German after-action reports and interrogations amplify the ground truth with human detail. In those statements, officers and NCOs described the moment when the supply line narrowed to a trickle and then to a stop,
"We pushed until the tanks told us to stop," one record paraphrases. When the tanks stopped, the momentum died. They describe attempts to keep engines warm in sub-zero nights, procedures that bled fuel and accelerated consumption, and desperate foraging for jerry cans in villages that had been stripped by months of war. Those testimonies are not attempts to excuse failure, so much as to record the texture of defeat. It was not always shells that finished machines. Often, it was the absence of fuel that made machines inert. The logistics ledger also shows that Allied commanders confronted their own moral choices. To burn a depot is to convert a usable resource into a military instrument of denial. The act has consequences. Local civilians witnessed smoke rise where their stores once stood. Allied soldiers assigned to the task experienced unease. But the staff calculus, manifested and mapped priorities and coded orders, reveals another element: strategic resilience. If denying a depot cost the enemy a chance to mount a local cavalry, denying it preserved a larger operational tempo that could not be risked for the sake of sentiment. The pragmatic voice in the reports is cold because it is literal. A destroyed depot cannot be used by anyone, but a captured depot can change the radius of an offensive. A concrete way to see that radius is to imagine movement as a supply equation.
Multiply the fuel a single heavy tank needs by the number of tanks in a formation, and then multiply by the kilometers the formation expects to traverse in a campaign. Add the fuel consumed by reconnaissance vehicles, which by design move more frequently. Add the trucks used to carry ammunition and rations. Add the aircraft overhead, whose sorties consume petrol by the hour. The numbers balloon. What to some appears as petty hoarding, rationed leaders, restricted allocations, in the staff office is in fact the arithmetic of movement. Consequently, denying even seemingly small concentrations of fuel could have outsized tactical effects, but only if the enemy lacked a nearby redundant system. Where the enemy possessed pipelines and reserve depots, denial at the edge was a minor inconvenience. Where the enemy did not, denial could be decisive. That divergence in logistic posture, redundancy versus scarcity, helps explain the psychological reaction among German troops at places like Hansfond. They had been taught and trained to value captured supply as a force multiplier. They expected that seizing an Allied dump would translate into operational breathing space. The discovery of 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, the figure recorded in local summaries, produced a short-lived euphoria because it seemed for a moment to confirm a fundamental assumption that capture could replenish the offensive. When they later learned that such caches were a fraction of Allied reserves and that entire depots were being burned by the enemy, the euphoria curdled into uncomprehension and then despair. The shock was not merely practical, but existential. They were facing an opponent who could afford strategic denial. We must be precise in describing the burning operations themselves, because the image of waste can obscure the nuance of military decision-making. In many documented cases, the choice to destroy was preceded by explicit assessment. Engineers and quartermasters considered retrieval impossible if the depot was threatened by imminent overrun, and if the staff judged that moving the supplies elsewhere would expose even more critical nodes. Where it was possible to move fuel backwards to safer installations, they did so. Where that was impossible, they destroyed. It was not a blanket policy of wanton destruction, but a targeted policy of selective denial tied to an operational map. At Stavelo, witnesses on both sides recorded the spectacle with a mixture of disbelief and grim acceptance. A local report filed after the war mentions children who remembered the sky darkening with smoke. The German troops who approached the area later in December recorded their surprise, but also the practical result. The burned fuel had not been available to them, and the absence showed in the stalled lines. A captured logbook lists Stavelo with a terse notation: destroyed, enemy priority.
The double irony is hard to escape. The men who guarded and burned the fuel were preserving a strategic mechanism that, in aggregate, would outstrip the tactical gains a single depot could provide. This is the moment where moral language and military arithmetic intersect. From the perspective of the men on the ground, the burnings could feel monstrous. For planners, they were an instrument of survival. The difference is not only perspective, but scale. At the scale of a regiment, a depot is a treasure. At the scale of a theater, the availability of many such depots and of pipelines and convoys redefines what counts as treasure. One way to make that theater visible is through a single graphic detail recorded in a number of sources, the fuel gauge. Quartering parties and photographers later noted tanks whose gasoline gauges read empty, though their turrets were intact. Photographs capture the glass faces of instruments clouded with frost. A needle resting at 0 becomes a symbol of failure, not of design, but of the underlying supply web that sustains design. The sight of a turret turned toward an enemy, yet unable to rotate the engine, is a powerful contradiction. The instrument for projection exists, but lacks the resource to be animated. Even as the Allied machine pushed supply forward, the Germans attempted improvisation. Units stripped rear areas for petrol, siphoned civilian tanks where possible, and converted prisoners' rations into fuel by barter. When that failed, commanders attempted to economize. Orders limited non-essential idling, prioritized fuel to certain units, and issued strict consumption quotas. Those measures were pragmatic and often ruthless in their own way, because rationing fuel to some units necessarily left others stationary. The human cost of those choices, patrols canceled, evacuations delayed, wounded men left longer on the field, appears in diaries and hospital logs with a tone of personal grievance. It is worth emphasizing at this point that logistical imbalance did not render tactical skill irrelevant. German forces often fought with tenacity and skill. In localized engagements, they achieved success, surprised Allied units, and inflicted casualties. The point is that victory in modern industrial war depends on sustaining those successes beyond the ephemeral moment. When an armored formation wins a day and cannot refuel for the next, its tactical gain evaporates. The Ardennes offensive is full of moments where operational promise, a breakthrough achieved by bold movement and audacious tactics, could not be consolidated because the machines that made movement possible had been starved. As supply maps and manifests are read alongside photographic evidence, another truth emerges. The Allied strategy was intentionally overwhelming. Saturate the theater with enough reserves that tactical losses in a single place were not strategic defeats.
That strategic redundancy had a cost, industrial, economic, and moral, but it also represented a commitment to an overwhelming sustaining power. For the Germans, that commitment posed a problem of convergence. Even if they could win a tactical engagement here and there, shifting the strategic balance required denying not only local supplies, but the entire sustainment chain. That was, by late 1944, increasingly beyond their capacity. There are also darker facets to consider. The logistical edge did not erase atrocities. The Malmedy massacre, a documented war crime committed by members of the Waffen-SS, where American prisoners were murdered, remains a sobering reminder that operational context can never be used to justify atrocity. It is important to be explicit. Atrocities occurred, and they must be recorded and remembered as crimes. In some captured German interrogations, narratives attempted to link extreme behavior to desperation or to the stress of shortages. These explanations do not mitigate culpability, nor can the strategic logic of supply be allowed to obscure the moral responsibility of individuals and commands who ordered or carried out illegal acts. The documentary record makes another uncomfortable point. Decisions about fuel and denial had consequences for civilians too. Where depots were burned, local inhabitants sometimes lost heating supplies crucial in winter. Where convoys passed, requisitioning and requisitions could strip villages of fuel and food. The war's arithmetic turned civilian goods into military variables, and that conversion inflicted hardship. The ledger books rarely capture that suffering directly. It emerges in post-war interviews, in local municipal records, and testimony gathered years later. That human residue complicates a straightforward reading of strategic necessity. Returning to the visual archive, we find images that resonate. Long columns of supply trucks crossing broken bridges, men in oilskins pumping fuel into drums beneath a leaden sky, engineers kneeling to repair ruptured pipelines with frozen fingers. These are images of labor as much as logistics, the sweat and improvisation that made strategic planning real. Logistics is often painted as an impersonal machine, yet the machine required countless human acts. The driver who kept going despite frostbite, the mechanic who patched a ruptured hose with a piece of rubber, the quartermaster who kept a calm ledger in the middle of chaos.
Those human moments complicate any simple moral judgment about the burnings. They show the grit behind the arithmetic. If the sequence of maps, manifests, and images is persuasive on its own, one of the most striking pieces of evidence is the shift in German command language over the course of the offensive. Early plans are suffused with confidence about capturing supplies. Later dispatches focus on conserving and surviving. That tonal shift is not academic, it is operational.
It is the moment when commanders stop assuming that a breakthrough will feed itself and start assuming that scarcity will govern decisions. The psychological effect on troops is measurable in accounts. Morale drops when supply promises vanish, and morale often sustains offensive initiative more reliably than individual valor. So, how do we reconcile this elevated operational picture with the opening image that launched this episode? A man shot 5 times, a mass grave that made no sense on first glance. We need to be candid. The dramatized vignette at the start of the program was a composite, a metaphor in human form for the bewilderment soldiers felt when confronted with both violent death and the strange administrative spectacle of burned abundance. In many cases, deaths in the Ardennes came from bullets, shrapnel, and cold. In others, they were indirect casualties of logistical failure, delayed medical evacuation, failed resupply, immobilized vehicles leaving men exposed. The mass grave that defies logic is thus both literal in the sense that bodies accumulated where operations stalled, and metaphorical in the sense that the true cause of some deaths lay in a systemic imbalance. Machine hunger met human flesh, and the arithmetic of supply decided who would move and who would not. That combined reality is perhaps the bleakest lesson. One can stand in a modern armory and marvel at engineering and production, and one can stand over a battlefield and mourn for the individual lives cut short. In the Ardennes, those perspectives coexisted uncomfortably. The sight of a burning depot was at once an instrument of strategy and a spectacle of waste. The abandoned tank was at once testament to mechanical design and to industrial failure. A museum tank with an empty gauge captures that paradox in a single frame. The craftsmanship remains, museum lighting preserves the metal, but the instrument that would animate it, fuel, is absent, and that absence is what tells the fuller story. As historians have noted, and as official logistics histories confirm, modern war is often won in factories and depots as much as on the ridgelines. The decisive factor becomes the ability to keep forces moving day after day. The Ardennes was not simply a failure of tactics, it was the point at which a tactical gamble met an opponent whose capacity for sustained movement exceeded the gamble's arithmetic. The German offensive reached impressive tactical achievements in places, but those achievements could not be turned into a lasting operational success because the enemy supply machine was larger and more resilient. There is an ethical aftertaste to that conclusion. Abundance is not inherently virtuous, nor is scarcity inherently ignoble, but the choices commanders make when abundance exists are morally freighted.
To destroy fuel to deny the enemy is a strategy. To do so when it harms civilians is a moral cost. To treat burned resources as mere ledger entries is to risk dehumanizing the actors who are ordered to light the matches. The archives preserve both the cold language of manifests and the warm, broken language of diaries. Both must be read to understand the full picture. In the end, the title that brought you here, that arresting image of execution and a mass grave, serves its narrative purpose by focusing attention on the human face of an otherwise technical tale. But the documents tell a stranger, often more dispassionate story, that in a war of machines, what looks like madness to one side can be sober calculation to the other. That the space between tactical possibility and strategic reality is measured not in courage alone, but in gallons and pipelines, and that the human cost of those arithmetic choices accumulates quietly in hospital logs and local recollections. The concrete remnants of that winter remain, piles of empty jerry cans photographed and labeled in unit files, the blackened ring of a burned pit preserved in a map notation, and in museum halls, the tanks that once prowled the Ardennes now stand motionless, their fuel gauges permanently at zero, not because of damage, but because the fuel that would have sent them forward was never available. Those objects, cans, gauges, burned rings, are small and eloquent testimonies. They link the moral question with the mechanical fact. If you want to examine the primary sources and the manifest scans that underpin this narrative, you'll find them linked in the pinned description. We've included unit diaries, engineer reports, and a selection of secondary readings that explore logistics and production in depth. For anyone who wants to read beyond this episode, Reputable starting points include official U.S. Army logistics histories and scholarship that treats the industrial dimensions of the war, such as works by established historians on wartime production and supply. As you close this episode in your mind, think of the empty turret and the cold gauge as less a symbol of failure than as a small, stubborn witness to the truth we have tried to hold here. In the modern industrial battlefield, arithmetic can be more lethal than ordnance. Men still die by bullets and frost and hate, but sometimes the more decisive force is the impersonal calculus that keeps those bullets moving and the frost at bay. That is the sobering lesson of Hansfeld, Stavelot, and the Ardennes winter. If this episode moved you and you want the source list, detailed manifests, and a companion article with maps, subscribe and check the pinned description now. There you'll find the archival references and suggested readings to explore further.